Before we get started, be sure to adjust the YouTube video settings to 60 frames per second for the best possible experience.
In a world where frame rate is the only thing that matters in a video game, a terror lurks in the shadows. It paralyzes you by disabling your controls. It hurts your feelings by making you feel like you're playing a downgraded game. It tricks you into thinking you're watching a movie. It's the cinematic game, presented in 30 frames per second.
Recently there has been a huge uproar where gamers are complaining when a game is not 60 frames per second. They spout ignorant cries about how this is the 8th generation and 1080p 60 frames per second should be the standard for every game. Well, I'm here to say it's not. At least not for every type of game. Ubisoft and Ready at Dawn have pretty much been taking the brunt of all this outrage, and it has a lot to do with their decisions to use 30 frames per second instead of 60 frames per second for recent games like Assassin's Creed Unity and The Order 1886. I'm going to try and impress upon you why the developers have valid reasons for choosing 30 over 60, and also to squash some of the more common ridiculous arguments that have been flying around. Ever since the beginning of video games, there have been stories to experience, and games have various ways to tell their stories. Some use full motion video cutscenes, some use conversations via text boxes, some use puzzles that give you clues to a story. A game's mechanics can even aid in the storytelling process, and even the owner's manual to a game can present the story, especially for retro games. Games have continuously evolved in their artistic ambitions, and the cinematic game has become one of the more popular styles, especially in the past 5 to 10 years. A cinematic experience can be incorporated into almost any genre of game, and it pretty much has been. When a lot of people hear the word cinematic, they often automatically just think cutscene, but that's not the case. If it was, then Pac-Man would be considered cinematic with its opening cutscene. Cinematic is a stylistic choice in game design that tries to present a video game that feels and or looks like cinema or film. One of the first games to bring a player a truly cinematic experience is Metal Gear Solid, and it is also one of the most influential and revolutionary games ever created. Before Metal Gear Solid, the world was split into two, games and movies. This marked the beginning of an era where developers realized they could take a video game to the next level of storytelling. Games now were using full casts of actors, directors, scriptwriters, editors, composers, and just about every other person you could find in the making of a Hollywood movie. The advancements of 3D technology also helped. Metal Gear Solid relied heavily on cutscenes and continuous dialogue between the cast of characters, and it also used cinematic letterbox format for the cutscenes. In Metal Gear Solid, the story is delivered similar to a movie in that the story never feels broken between moments of gameplay or cutscenes. It always feels like it seamlessly threads itself through the whole experience. At all times, your actions in the game are in direct relation to the story. That is, of course, unless you as a player are simply free roaming or just messing with the guards. Today, the technology and tools available are much different than when Metal Gear Solid 1 came out in 1998. Developers have figured out certain recipes that work best not only for certain types of games, but for certain types of experiences. This is where the big bad 30 frames per second comes into play. To get into the arguments, I will first address the one here where people say 30 and 60 looks the same, or they can't tell the difference. This is simply not true, and the reason people believe this could be for a number of reasons. Perhaps these people have been watching 60 frames per second footage on YouTube before the 60 frames per second option was available, and didn't realize it was presented in 30 frames per second. Perhaps they have an older television or monitor, or the display settings aren't optimized. And maybe they just haven't been eating their carrots and need to have their eyes checked. I will admit that if you look at two still images side by side, comparing 30 to 60, there is very little difference. The big difference becomes noticeable when there is on-screen movement and you see the foreground and background and characters' movements and how incredibly different they look. A couple websites I recommend are www.30versus60.com or www.30versus60fps.com. Just see for yourself and you'll see what I mean. Now that I've addressed how 30 and 60 looks different, I will get into the main point that I'm making in this video. 60 frames per second simply does not look normal. And by normal, I mean it does not look like the normally accepted aesthetic style that movies and television have been presented to us for so many years, which is one of the main reasons why a developer chooses to make a cinematic game using 30 frames per second. Now, framerate happens to be one of those things that affects more than one aspect of a game. Framerate not only affects how a game looks, but it also affects how the game handles. The looks part is all I'm concerned with at this point in the video, so keep that in mind. Now, I'm not saying 60 frames per second looks bad, but I am saying 60 frames per second does not look correct for cinematic experiences. 60 frames per second ends up making the movements in a game look sped up. The game almost looks like it is being overdriven, or it's running like it's at 1.25 speed. Also, the objects in the game almost look celled or over-sharpened. The borderlines between objects in the background and foreground tend to look too bold, and dynamic lighting and shadows can actually be less fluid. Yes, 60 frames per second looks smooth, but it is a very sharp and aggressive smooth, and depending on the game, it kind of makes everything look cartoony. Movies and TV look softer and more balanced. If you have ever been flipping through channels on TV and came across a soap opera, you might have noticed that something doesn't look right. Soap operas use a different filming technique to create a unique visual style for dramatic effect. In fact, many modern TVs have been featuring settings that create the same effect, and many people do not like it. The soap opera effect is similar to a 60 FPS game, where the image almost looks hyper-real and not in a good way, especially for certain types of games. Another example is the Hobbit movie, which was filmed at higher frame rate, and it caused quite a commotion. Some people were so unhappy with the look they left the movie demanding refunds, and many people felt sick due to the effect it had on their eyes. In an article from TotalXbox.com, an interview with the developers for The Division and the topic of using 30 frames per second is discussed. The title to the article paraphrases a quote from the interview with Ubisoft Massive's Ryan Bernard that is perfect for justification right off the bat for using 30 frames per second. It says that, quote, "graphical fidelity and immersion are more important than frame rate," end quote. And for a game like this with so much detail and being in third person, I couldn't agree more, especially in regard to graphical fidelity. Fidelity is the degree to which an electronic device accurately reproduces its effect, such as sound or picture. Basically what this means is that 30 frames per second works better for making things look more graphically realistic, and not only in comparison to cinematic movies if that's the goal, but more so in comparison to reality. Like I said earlier, 60 frames per second looks good, but it makes things look sort of animated and not as realistic, especially when real things such as humans or realistic imagery is used. Another bogus claim that people make is that the video game industry is being held back from all this 30 FPS business. The first flaw to this claim is that it implies that just because one developer uses 30 FPS, it means all of the rest of them have to use 30 FPS, which is ridiculous. Secondly, many people, especially PC elitists, blame the consoles themselves for holding back the industry. If this was the case, there wouldn't be 120 frames per second gaming on PC. PC gaming would be equal to the console as far as specs are concerned. People claim that current console hardware is weak and unable to handle 60 frames per second. Before I go on, let's take a little ride through history and look at some games. We're going all the way back to 1985, and we're going to make a few stops on the way, so grab your popcorn and hold on. Roll film. We have the Metroid Prime trilogy for the Wii from 2009. Lego Batman on the PSP and DS, 2008. Ninja Gaiden Sigma on the PS3 from 2007. Wii Sports on the Wii from 2006. Ridge Racer 6 on the Xbox 360 from 2005. Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes on the GameCube from 2004. Prince of Persia Sands of Time on the Game Boy Advance, 2003. Metal Gear Solid 2 on the PS2 from 2002. Sonic Adventure 2 on the Dreamcast from 2001. Animal Crossing on the GameCube and the N64 from 2001. Ray Crisis on the PS1 from 2000. Hydro Thunder on the PS1 from 1999. F-Zero X on the N64 from 1998. Bloody Roar on the PS1 from 1997. Killer Instinct Gold on the N64 from 1996. Battlesport on the 3DO from 1995. Virtua Fighter 2 on the arcade and other platforms from 1994. Daytona USA on the Sega Saturn from 1993. Let's jump ahead a little bit. Afterburner 2 on the arcade and other platforms from 1987. Outrun on the arcade and other platforms from 1986. And finally, we have Space Harrier on the arcade and other platforms from 1985. What do you think of all these games? Do they look good? Do they look fun? Maybe they do, but do you want to know what the most interesting part is about these games? They all use 60 frames per second. That's right, a game with 60 frames per second all the way back in
1985.
Pretty amazing, huh? There have been games that have been running at 60 frames per second for almost 30 years on all different types of platforms, even the Game Boy Advance. Let that just sink in for a second and keep those games in mind throughout the rest of the video. So, if the 8th gen consoles today can't handle 60 frames per second, then how come all those games I showed you from earlier times could handle 60 frames per second? Games from 30 years ago were using 60 frames per second, yet for some reason modern technology just can't squeeze out the coveted 60 frames per second. I don't think so. And here's another point. As of right now, during the time that I am working on this video, the Xbox One has 14 games that are 1080p 60 frames per second, and the PS4 has 36 games that are 1080p 60 frames per second, and the Wii U also has a bunch. There are other games that are 60 frames per second at different resolutions as well. This proves that the hardware is fully capable of 60 frames per second, and 30 FPS has nothing to do with the limitations. It has everything to do with deliberate and accurate game design, where the developers are specifically aiming for a certain aesthetic with a certain level of detail and a certain type of experience. And for some games, this just happens to work best with 30 frames per second. Since we are on the topic of the 8th gen consoles, this leads into the next argument, which is that this is the 8th generation, so 60 frames per second should be the gold standard for every game, and 30 FPS is just a downgrade. Now, what's so special about the 8th gen that automatically means that every game should now be 60 frames per second? I already showed 3 decades worth of games that are 60 frames per second, and plenty of examples of the 8th gen console's abilities to handle 60 frames per second, so there isn't much more to argue there. Framerate has nothing to do with any specific generation of gaming or time period. There is no gold standard of today for framerate. Developers choose framerates at any time specifically for a desired aesthetic and overall experience. By today's standards for TV and movies, we would say everything should be in color. But what about movies like Schindler's List or Sin City, which were black and white? Or what about the video game Limbo? If they were in color, they would have made for a very different experience. Or how about Shovel Knight, a game that was specifically designed using strict 8-bit standards, that was very well received and actually won Indie Game of the Year at the Game Awards, yet it was designed using outdated specs to the original Nintendo. Nobody seemed to be complaining about limitations or downgrades with Shovel Knight. And seriously, does every game need to be 60 frames per second? I mean, I can't wait for Rapala's Bass Pro Fishing in 60 frames per second. Or how about an Ultra HD remastered definitive 60 frames per second edition of The Flowers of Robert Mapplethorpe?
Robert Mapplethorpe's flower photographs capture an elegance, verve, and sensuous beauty that is clearly the product of his unique artistic vision. Many photographers have taken pictures of flowers, but few have used the camera the way he did, instilling monumental dignity and graceful simplicity to the complex shapes and brilliant colors of floral sprays and blossoms.
But seriously, what about games like Faster Than Light? Or South Park, The Stick of Truth? I actually thought South Park was one of the best looking video games I've ever seen, primarily because it looked exactly like the cartoon. It would have looked a lot different and not as accurate if it wasn't 60 frames per second. 30 frames per second will not ruin your experience for certain games just because you think it's a lower standard, and in many cases it's a better choice. Now, I don't even know where some of these arguments come from anyway. I've been gaming through 3 decades and have never heard framerate being such a big issue until the past year or two. You never heard anybody complain that Red Dead Redemption sucked because it was 30 frames per second, or Final Fantasy VII was just unplayable. You couldn't even select the correct item during battle. I mean, look at how horribly difficult it is due to the frame rate. It's so hard to control. And the visuals are so bad, it looks like an Atari game. They should just make a game called 60 frames per second so all of you can be happy, I guess. Nowadays, it's like a game needs to have a huge banner slapped on the front cover that says 60 frames per second. You never even really heard frame rate mentioned in any Nintendo Power or Electronic Gaming Monthly magazine, yet it has been an integral part of game design ever since the beginning. Now all you hear about is resolutions and frame rates, and it's all a bunch of marketing BS that is fed to fanboys to use as ammunition in their console wars and to hype up a game, that's it. Also, a lot of it comes from certain members of the PC gaming community, like the PC elitists bragging about the 12 million frames per second. I'm not saying everybody is like that, but there are certainly fanboys from all sides and every platform that are not helping the situation. I also think it has a lot to do with younger gamers that have grown up playing games like Call of Duty at 60 frames per second, and they expect every game to handle like an FPS, and I have actually seen comments from people basically saying that very same thing. Many people also claim that 60 frames per second is always superior. Well, in what way? From a detail standpoint, 30 seems to do the better job at the moment. Just look at a small example of the most recent games like Infamous Second Son, Alien Isolation, the Silent Hills playable teaser, Grand Theft Auto 5, and Destiny. These games have some of the most breathtaking visuals and highest graphical fidelity we have ever seen, yet they run at 30 frames per second. Even the 7th gen versions of The Last of Us and Tomb Raider, and even Beyond Two Souls and Metal Gear Solid 4 look better than some 8th gen games that are 60 frames per second during gameplay. Upcoming games like The Order 1886, Bloodborne, and The Division also look very promising at 30 frames per second. The PS4 version of The Last of Us actually has a selectable frame rate where you can choose a locked 30 frames per second or an unlocked 60 frames per second. This is great because it allows the player to decide on what type of experience they prefer. Interestingly, when 30 frames per second is selected, the game does play more cinematic, and when 60 frames per second is chosen, it plays more arcade-like, even though it is the same game. The other side of thinking 60 is always superior to 30 has to do with how the game handles. This is the part of the video where we drift away from talking strictly about visuals and start talking about the differences in how the game handles. I will admit that it is a fact that 60 frames per second provides less latency with the controls. Some people seem to feel that 30 frames per second is just too unresponsive. Whether or not 30 frames per second is just too unresponsive pretty much boils down to personal opinion though, and in my opinion, 30 FPS is totally acceptable, especially with certain types of games. The biggest problem I have with how people feel about the handling of a game at 30 FPS is that their complaints are totally exaggerated. People act like they can't even jump on a Goomba or choose the right attack during a turn-based RPG. The difference is so minimal it should be no problem for a player to adapt and familiarize themselves with the controls. Every time I play a game, I take a minute or two to study the controls and play around with how they feel, and I've never had any problems associated with the game being 30 frames per second. I've never died or missed a platform simply because I didn't have an extra precious 30 frames to help me with the controls. 30 and 60 shouldn't even really be looked at as being better or worse than each other, they are just different. I see it as kind of like driving a car and driving a pickup truck. One doesn't necessarily drive better, it's just that they drive differently, and you would need to get used to how they handle because you don't drive a car and truck the same. You don't take a car off-road, you don't take corners as fast in a truck. Another point to add is that if you are playing a 30 FPS game, everything in the game is moving at 30 FPS, not just you. People make it sound like the player is moving at a slow 30 frames per second and they just can't keep up with the rest of the game, like everything else is moving at 60 frames per second. If you are playing a 30 FPS game, then even the bad guy shooting at you or a gap you have to jump across is moving at 30 FPS, so there should be no problems with the player being able to handle the game. If they do have problems, I guess maybe they have poor hand-eye coordination or just slow reflexes or something. Dark Souls is a game that runs at 30 frames per second and has been heavily criticized for its problems with frame rate. But the problem isn't simply that it's 30 frames per second, the problem is that it had really bad inconsistencies and frame rate drops. When your frame rate fluctuates, you can't really keep yourself in tune with the controls. Each time you press a button, you might experience a differently timed action, which can really ruin your experience. Inconsistent frame rate can also cause screen tearing, judder, and other visual blemishes. In an article by Eurogamer, a study was conducted by Digital Foundry to compare unlocked and locked frame rates. In the study, Digital Foundry takes a look at a few games and discovers that just having a higher frame rate does not automatically mean it's a better gameplay experience. When looking at Killzone Shadowfall, they discovered they preferred the locked 30 frames per second over the unlocked 60 frames per second. The consistency of the locked frame rate provided much more satisfying experience with more reliable controller input and smoother visuals. On a side note, one interesting thing the developers did for Killzone was that they made the campaign 30 frames per second and the online multiplayer 60 frames per second. This was an interesting design choice and one that I appreciate because it allows the player to experience the game specifically as it was designed. The campaign can feel a little more cinematic, and the multiplayer can feel more arcade-like, similar to how The Last of Us is on PS4. Other games that were studied were Tomb Raider Definitive Edition, Titanfall, Need for Speed Rivals, and Crysis 3. In the end, there were mixed results between each game, and there was no clear-cut answer to what the best settings are. The higher unlocked frame rate was found better for Tomb Raider, and Digital Foundry even said, quote, "In PC gaming, the potential bottlenecks vary from system to system and game to game. A 30 FPS lock can be a good thing in getting rock-solid consistent performance." End quote. There is one caveat though that is very important when it comes to frame rate, and that is online gaming. When playing online with a console, frame rate is usually pretty consistent due to everybody playing with the same hardware. The only problems usually come from a bad internet connection that may cause lag. PC gaming is a lot more different than consoles though, due to all the different hardware configurations and specifications used on each individual PC. When playing online with the PC, it is a lot more important to have the best performance possible. This is even more important if you are playing games like competitive online first-person shooters, or as I like to call them, fast point-and-click shooters. When playing against other people, your hardware can make all the difference when reaction time is vital to your game. If your frame rate or other factors in your game cause any kind of delay, you could end up losing the game. One player's PC might be capable of only 30 frames per second, and another player's PC might be capable of 120 frames per second, and the 120 frames per second player will have an advantage over the other player. Other game types that should favor higher frame rate are fighting games and racing games where fast twitch controls are typically preferred over visuals. Sometimes a slower frame rate actually makes a game play more natural and more realistic than at a higher frame rate. Since I mentioned Dark Souls earlier, I'll use it again for this topic. In Dark Souls, you are typically wearing heavy armor and using heavy melee weapons. If you were using this kind of equipment in real life, you would have to be very coordinated and physically fit to handle the weight of everything. Your movements would be very delayed and awkward and physically demanding. By playing at 30 frames per second rather than at a higher frame rate, it is more true to how it would be with somebody's reaction time and mobility if they were actually in the Dark Souls universe. If a higher frame rate made it easier with the way the game felt, it would feel faked and less immersive. Many other games, especially cinematic games, definitely benefit from being 30 frames per second for this very reason. There are countless other arguments that people try to make that have to do with totally irrelevant things like motion blur, or say things like the human eye doesn't see in frames and more, but those are all a bunch of fallacious arguments that don't even apply to this subject. The technical differences between the way a game and a movie is made has nothing to do with anything. It is the final product that matters. If a developer sprinkled magic fairy dust on the game to make it look more cinematic, then good job. Also, our eyes don't see in oil and canvas either, yet we still can appreciate a fine painting with our own eyes. A final argument that doesn't hold water is that games aren't movies. Well, you could also say apples and oranges aren't the same, except they both have the same job. We eat them, we drink them, we make other food-related products out of them. Games and movies might not be the same, but they have the same job. And games have actually surpassed movies and are better at their job than movies. No other medium allows for the same level of entertainment, interactivity, and immersion as a video game. Movies have not really changed in decades other than the recent use of 3D. The technology in games has outgrown and outpaced movies now, and games are quickly becoming as big of an industry player as Hollywood movies. Games are using live actors now, and even some games are using the letterbox screen where the top and bottom of the display has black bars for a more cinematic style. I don't know about you guys, but I've been ready for games to evolve and grow up for a long time. I don't really like to watch cartoons on TV anymore, and I'm getting tired of playing video games that look like cartoons. I'm not saying cartoony video games are bad, or you as a gamer is bad for playing them. I'm just saying what I prefer. I still like playing games like Mario or Donkey Kong, but they just don't offer the same level of immersion or thought-provoking interaction as other types of games. The more cinematic and less cartoony a game becomes, then the more realistic and immersive it can be. Many of us have a huge thank you to give to Hideo Kojima for sparking this incredible type of game that has given us so many incredible experiences.
Yeah, I don't see what people see in Kojima, honestly. Metal Gear Solid 4 is the best game ever. Kojima's a fucking asshole. What a low-life piece of shit Kojima is, really. I mean that sincerely, too, I do. That's right, Kojima, I just beat you. I just fucking beat you at your own game. Kojima fails again. Like, how many times can he fail in this playthrough of this game? Bad game design all around. Punch the switch. How do you punch the fucking switch? I'm so tired of this shit. Kojima's a fucking cocksucker. If I ever find him, I'm gonna kick him straight in his fucking balls. I'm serious, man. What an asshole. Look, what punch? How do you punch the button? How? Explain. I'm not a fucking genius.
I can't wait to play a game that is so cinematic and immersive that I actually forget that it's a video game. After all, that is the highest level of immersion. So many people treat cinematic games like they're a joke, yet cinematic games have the most potential out of any type of game. A game that only has mechanics can only take you so far, but a cinematic game can have great mechanics, and a great story, deeply developed characters, and a much deeper level of immersion. A cinematic game truly has the most to offer to the player, and that's a fact, even if it is at 30 frames per second. Thank you for watching.